Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores our human condition from the why we do what we do perspective. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. On Behavioral Grooves, we like to talk with researchers and authors and practitioners to unlock the mysteries of our behavior by using a behavioral science lens. But before we get into our episode, Kurt, I wanted to ask you if you've ever been paralyzed by perfectionism.
I was paralyzed right there because I'm trying to be perfect. I mean, I'm paralyzed all the time. I mean, come on, perfection. No, it's a really good question. I guess, I mean, I'm not really sure what perfectionism really is.
Well, let's listen to what our guest has to say about that.
Okay, so perfectionism is often confused with things like conscientiousness, diligence, perseverance, meticulousness, all these great things that come from a very active, optimistic place of wanting to do better, wanting to improve, etc. Perfectionism is not those things. Perfectionism comes from a much deeper place. It comes from a place of lack and a sense of inadequacy, essentially, that I'm not good enough, I'm not perfect enough. And so all of this striving, all of these needs to impression manage and perfect everything and all around us really comes from a place of, well, I have to prove to other people in the world around me that I'm not flawed, that I'm not deficient. And so striving for perfection is really the way that in our minds we think that we can do that.
Okay, well, given that definition, I think that I can definitely say that I have not been seduced by perfectionism. At least in my case, where, I get to, this element where, that's good enough. And I'm perfectly happy with that, right? As we can tell.
Perfectly. You're perfectly happy when you have perfectionism in your imperfection.
Maybe that's it. I don't know. How about you?
Well, I can speak to striving for perfection in my youth, certainly in my musical life, at least. I was, desperately as a young teenager trying to overcome some perceived inadequacies in my life. And music was the way that I thought I could, get healed, basically, or make something that was broken whole, which, of course, it like the good effect was I practiced a lot. I got really good.
You're good at music.
Yeah, but it didn't heal any of the troubled areas in my life. So
it didn't fill that hole. It did not. Yeah. And that our guest Thomas Curran helps us to better understand where that perfectionism comes from, which he pointed out is not what most people think. And he emphasizes how changing something like our mindset can make huge strides in helping us deal with those issues.
Yeah, Thomas Curran is a professor of psychology and behavioral science at the esteemed London School of Economics, or LSE, for those in the know.
And you are definitely in the know.
Well, he's also the author of The Perfection Trap, Embracing the Power of Good Enough, which was just released August 8th in 2023. In the book, he explores the roots of perfectionism in wider society and explains how it affects our mental health and productivity.
Best of all, we talked about practical strategies for overcoming it by learning to embrace imperfections in work, play, relationships, podcasts, all of those things.
I was super pleased to learn that Thomas is a guitarist and a researcher and an author, like this mighty triumvirate that I can only aspire to.
No, Tim, I already thought you were that. In fact, I think you're a quadravant, whatever four would be, adding on podcasting to those other three. There you go. So, yeah. Okay. All right. So one more thing before we jump into our conversation with Thomas, we want to let you know that there is some swirling sounds going on from time to time. We tried, but we couldn't fix 100% of it. We're not that perfect, but we wanted to let you know that it's not in your headphones. It's in the recording.
Yeah, for some reason, we got some of what recording engineers call anomalous digital artifacts in the mix, and we apologize. So for now, I have to get back to my pursuit of perfection. Oh, just kidding.
Hey, man, relax.
Okay.
We don't have to be perfect all the time. Okay. So why don't you just join the Groovers by sitting back in a comfortable spot. Pour yourself a nice frothy draft of imperfection satisficing mindset and listen to our conversation with Thomas Curran.
Thomas Curran, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you for having me.
We are happy to have you here, and we need to find out first in our speed round, do you prefer scotch or beer?
Beer.
Ooh, nice. Decisiveness.
All right.
That's a plus.
So if you had to pick a place to live, would it be, and forgive me, I am going to
you're going to totally screw this up.
I'm going to mess up the pronunciation of both of these names. So Wellingborough, England, or Padua, Italy?
Padua, 100%. Yeah. Okay. It's warm. Everyone's really friendly. It's chilled out. Yeah, definitely Padua.
I love that. Wow. Coming from somebody who lives in the UK or grew up in the UK, that's fantastic. Okay, third speed round question. Which is more stressful, giving a TED Talk or writing a book?
That's not a fair choice.
Oh. Wow. So both are. There's no stress in either one, right?
Actually, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I could do them both in my sleep. Oh goodness me, they're both horrendous.
Well, we might have to talk about that.
Okay.
So, is there a difference in the kind of stress that you get from each of them?
One just goes on forever. One has a definitive ending point, but the definitive ending point is so stressful. I would rather string it out over time like you can with a book.
Oh, man.
I don't know. I would probably say writing a book is probably my preferred form of communication, so let's go with that.
Okay. Well, good. There you go. All right. Last speed round question. Do you recommend that a perfectionist write a book about perfectionism?
No. Well, you need to ask my editor this question, not me.
Okay, fair enough.
So you were very open in the book that you consider yourself a perfectionist, and you're writing this book about perfectionism. So let's just start, though, before we get into that, about what is your definition of perfectionism, and help our listeners understand exactly what you're talking about here.
Okay, so perfectionism is often confused with things like conscientiousness, diligence, perseverance, meticulousness, all these great things that come from a very active, optimistic place of wanting to do better, wanting to improve, etc. Perfectionism is not those things. Perfectionism comes from a much deeper place. It comes from a place of lack and a sense of inadequacy, essentially, that I'm not good enough, I'm not perfect enough. And so all of this striving, all of these needs to impression manage and perfect everything and all around us really comes from a place of, well, I have to prove to other people in the world around me that I'm not flawed, that I'm not deficient. And so striving for perfection is really the way that in our minds we think that we can do that. So it's really the starting point that's important to recognize when we talk about perfectionism, and it comes from a place of deficiency.
I think in lay terms, a lot of people would associate having high standards with perfectionism. Are they in the same ballpark?
Well, high standards are, as I say, there's a common conventional wisdom that perfectionism is synonymous with high standards, but that's just not the case. Perfectionism can produce high standards. People with perfectionism do shoot for very high goals, but the reason why they shoot for those goals is important for us to recognize, and that we're trying at all times to prove to the world that we're worth something, that we're not flawed, that we're not inadequate, that there's something of value to us. And so we do strive for high standards, but we're doing so very much in a very defensive way to try to conceal and hide what we think is imperfect inside, and that's. And that really is I think that we have to grasp that kind of rooted sense of deficit if we want to understand what perfectionism really is or how it really impacts us.
So one of the things that you said in the book that really struck me as interesting, because I had never thought about it in this way. And now that you're talking about the definition of perfectionism, I think it makes a little more sense. But, and I'm going to quote, it says, you state, quote, perfectionism is not a personal obsession. it's a decidedly cultural one, end quote. And so in that piece, can you help us understand what that is, and how is perfectionism cultural, and what is that cultural part, the piece that says we have to be perfect, and if we're not, that's the black part that you talked about, this need to kind of showcase this? Or how does that parlay itself into what perfectionism is?
Yeah, so let's go back to what I said a minute ago about perfectionism coming from deficit. A sense that I'm not enough, I'm not perfect enough, and therefore I have to go about the world proving to other people and everyone all around me that I'm worth something, that I matter, that I'm validated, I'm approved of. And there's a curious symmetry there between how society itself functions, in a sense, because if you think about the way the economy works, it works on the same deficit system. But we have to continually strive to do more, to be more, to consume more in order for our economy to grow. Because consumption in a service economy, a supply-side economy like ours, requires thermonuclear levels of consumption in order to keep itself standing still, never mind growing. So at all times, we have to be held in a state of not quite having or being enough in this moment. There's always something more. There's always something we can buy. There's always more work we can put in. There's always more hustling, more grinding we can do, and that really gets into the bones after a while. And I think if we want to understand what's happening with young people in particular, but everyone really, when we talk about perfectionism being so widespread and these beliefs really cutting across all sorts of different people, we have to look to our society and our economy and ask, what is it in that society? What is it in that economy that's creating those feelings of not being enough, of not having enough, of not doing enough? And as I say, I think there's symmetry between the perfectionistic beliefs of deficit and also an economy that needs us to feel a sense of deficit in order for it to grow.
This economic analogy is really beautiful, and it makes me think about in behavioral science we talk about maximizing or versus satisficing, and how, going back to Herb Simon's comment, that we can derive a lot more joy in life out of satisficing than maximizing. But what you're describing here is more of a maximizing sense associated with perfectionism.
And it's also why it's so wrong-headed, because it's not only more joy, but you also get more productivity. You actually get more out with a more balanced, more harmonious way of living and working. And we know this is so much data, but probably the most interesting data right now that's coming out is a 4-day-week experiment, which is showing that actually, you can take a day away and still get the same productivity from people, because in the moments of the hour in work, they're replenished, they're rejuvenated, they're happy. They're producing the same amounts, in some cases more. It's remarkable. So this push to maximize is driving us to perfectionism. It's not making us happier. And there's also a lot of evidence to suggest it's not making us work any harder or any more productive either.
Well, and I think there's another aspect of this, that the people that get highlighted in the press and natural, the Steve Jobs of the world, the Elon Musks of the world, who are on famously talking about 100-hour work weeks and different pieces. And those are the people that are kind of out there on the pedestal that we go, well, if I want to succeed, this is how they did it, and that's what's being out there. So is that part of this cultural component as well, or how does that play in to this kind of element of perfectionism as it comes out?
Well, definitely. But by the way, we ignore counter examples. For someone like Richard Branson, for instance, he would be a lot more sanguine about giving yourself a bit of a break, having more time out, allowing yourself to make mistakes, and all this sort of stuff. Right? So that's the first point. Yes, but we do zero in on the kind of extreme outliers, and that's natural, right? Like these are the people who have kind of really soared to levels which become exceptionally interesting to the everyday person. But they're survivors as well, right? They've come through a very selective system which has required a lot of hard work, yes, diligence, yes, flexibility, yes, maybe even perfectionism, but also incredible amounts of luck, being in the right place at the right time, having met people or been in networks or being born to social circumstances that have made that transition a little bit easier. There's all sorts of different things that have occurred that are beyond those kind of, those self-narratives about hard work and all the rest of it that have led them to where they are. So, I mean, there's two things I'd say to that. The first is obviously there are counterexamples that shows it can be done without that amount of effort, but there's also survivor bias that we're falling into the trap of there by looking at these people thinking, oh, well, it must have been their perfectionism and hard work that got them there, and ignoring all the other factors that have been just as important, if not more.
Yeah, it's always interesting when people point out, oh, well, so-and-so gets up at 4 every morning and does this and this and this. And you go, okay, they might have been successful, but there are countless others who get up at 4 and do the same routine and are not the same, as you pointed out. It's that survivorship bias. It's that element of there's luck, there's, whatever is going into that situation that drives them. And as you said, when you look at the research, as you talked about the 4-day work week, what we're seeing is that the research doesn't necessarily hold up to that kind of lay person mentality, the ethos that is out there, that this is the only way of making the success, that we have to, hustle and strive and be constantly on. And that doesn't seem to be the case. So, and again, as Tim knows, I go off on my little tirades and I don't have a question following that up.
Can I come in there just quickly, because I can tell you exactly why that is.
Okay,
great.
So what you have is a situation where you kind of, if you think about returns to effort in terms of productivity as a kind of almost like an inverted U relationship. So there's a kind of perfect amount where it's comfortable, you're replenishing, you're getting time off, but you're also working hard. And then you burst through that threshold into a zone of decline in returns, where every additional hour you work is getting slightly less output. And then you can burst through that still, so that now every additional hour of work that you do is going to have the inverse returns to your productivity, because you're sacrificing things like sleep, time with friends, time off, rejuvenating activities that mean you can do work vitalized and rejuvenated, and therefore you're more productive. So basically what you're doing is you're burning yourself out. You're working so hard that it's unsustainable and you burn out. And this, by the way, is what perfectionists do all the time. And there's a really strong relationship to perfectionism and burnout.
Is there any, talking about the research, is there any research that you just turn to and you just go, wow, this is just gold? Like the results from this work just really, really help put up pinpoints, really highlight this specifically. I realize that there aren't any silver bullets, but this is, your book is about data. What's your favorite data?
Oh, my favorite data, I've got one study, which is in a really crappy journal. But this is the thing, like some of the best work is found in these little places. So that was the first, by the way, the burnout thing is the first reason why perfectionists, people that work so hard, go above and beyond, don't tend to perform as well as you might think they would. But the second reason is more fascinating, I think. And that's because when the going gets tough, perfectionistic people tend to withhold themselves. Let me give you, and I'll tell you this lab experiment where we show this. So we did a lab experiment a few years ago now. And we got people in the lab, and we used sports a really good microcosm of broader sort of competitive environment. We got them in the lab and we told them to do a cycling task, against the goal that they should comfortably meet. So you should cover this amount of distance in this amount of time based on your fitness. So it should be comfortable for you, no problem. So we say, away you go. We get them cycling really, really hard as they possibly can to meet this goal. And then at the end, we tell them no matter how well they did, you failed. You didn't quite meet the goal, unfortunately. And then we said, don't worry, you can have another go. And that's when something remarkable happens. So this is really beautiful. So the people who are not very high in perfectionism, when they have a second attempt after the first failure, they don't really change their effort, right? If anything, they put in a little bit more effort on the second attempt. But the perfectionistic people do the opposite. Their effort falls off a cliff. Wow. They just withhold themselves in that second attempt because the embarrassment, the guilt, the shame of having not met that goal they should have comfortably met, is so intense that they don't want to feel those things again. They don't want to put themselves through that embarrassment again. So they just take themselves away because you can't fail at something you didn't try at. And that's the internal dialogue that's going on in perfectionist people's mind. They're so intensely fearful of failure that they will do everything they can, including sabotaging their chances of success, to avoid it. And so that was a beautiful study. Again, it's in a really obscure journal, but that was a beautiful study that really demonstrated quite glaringly the extent to which perfectionist people can really get in the way of their own success by trying intently to avoid failure.
Which I think goes to the point of when you said the definition of perfectionism at the beginning. It's this deficit that people have, because again, I was assuming when you started describing this, that when the second chance came, that you were going to say perfectionists went doubled down on their effort and different things. But it makes absolute sense once you realize, oh, wait, they're protecting their ego. They're protecting that self kind of sense of worth. If I don't try, I can't be hurt. And I love that piece. I'm going to switch topics here as we're thinking about this, but when you look, is there any research that shows a parenting style? Is there anything, as we just realize you're a relatively new father, right? Is there anything? My kids are probably too late. I probably already screwed them up. But is there anything in the research about parenting style, helicopter parenting versus free range? Is there anything that lends itself to this, or is this a larger picture that isn't really part of what creates a perfectionist person?
I mean, there's so much empathy for parents. There's no one size fits all. There's no way to do it. I think you become a parent, you realise that you have all the greatest intentions, and then you find yourself as a helpless spectator.
That is no truer words were ever said. Right there.
There it is.
So just all the parents out there, please don't worry. Look, there are things you can do. There are broad philosophies that you can take into parenting that across all of the difficulties, struggles, and strife you can try to put into place. The big one is to not make your love, approval, affection contingent on success or failure. No matter what happens, whether your child has done well or whether they haven't done quite so well, love them. Just keep loving them all the time. There's a tendency and a temptation in this culture, this hyper-competitive culture where educational attainment is the be-all and end-all, quite literally, difference in your life chances, to subtly defer approval for your children when they haven't quite, made an A grade or done, stellar in school, right? To say, okay, yeah, that's great, but keep going, keep trying, keep working. And what that does is it tells the child that they're never really worth it. There's always something more that they have to attain before they're actually a worthwhile person. And I would, there's this temptation to do this, but I would do as much as you possibly can to try not to do that. Make sure that your kids know that, they're loved no matter what happens. And if they fail, and they will fail many, many times, and if they do, give them a hug and tell them that this is an indictment on you. It's just one test of many hundreds of different tests, unfortunately, that they're going to be subjected to across their school life. It doesn't mean that their parents don't value them as much. It doesn't mean that their teacher doesn't like them. It's just one of many tests, and there's going to be another one, and there's going to be another one after that, and there's going to be another one after that. So try not to pin those things on how you feel about yourself or, your emotional state in that moment. Try to see the bigger picture and learn from it instead. That's probably the biggest piece of advice I could give. Don't make a level affection continue.
That's fantastic. You never mention Carol Dweck in the book, but there's certainly a sense of growth mindset in just what you're saying right now. To move away from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. Does that resonate with you?
It does. However, I don't think Carol meant this to happen, but her growth mindset is sort of congealed into something of a cliche in modern culture, and has kind of has turned into something else whereby we feel all the time that we have to turn our shortcomings or failures or setbacks into growth or excellence, almost kind of rehabilitate those very humanizing experiences on the redemptive arc of something else, turn it into a learning experience. And I'm not saying that's always a bad thing, but sometimes in life there really is nothing you can learn from failing. you just slipped up, right? You got out of bed the wrong side.
Yeah, wow.
You knew what to do. You knew what to do, but you just didn't quite pull it off on that occasion. And I think this kind of obsession we have of turning everything into growth and growth and growth and more growth and more growth, and overlaid with perfectionism can lead us down, I would say, a difficult pathway. And I would say growth is great, but sometimes we don't always have to grow, and that's also great. And failure shouldn't define us, nor should it not define us. It just is a thing that we encounter as fallible human beings, and that sometimes we can just let it wash over us. Sometimes we can just let it in and not do anything with it, and that's okay. So yes, I am a fan of growth mindset, but taken to an extreme, I think it can turn into perfection.
Well, that's good for us, Tim, because we have failures all the time, and we just let that roll off of our backs, never learning anything from it all the time. So we're doing good there. Thomas, in the book, you talk about 3 types of perfectionism. Can you talk a little bit about those, the self-oriented, socially prescribed, and other-oriented piece?
Yeah, so over many, many decades, and this is not my work, this is work by many different researchers and clinicians, but in particular Paul Hewitt and Gordon Fleck, Canadian professors who have done much of the heavy lifting here. And in their clinical observations and research, they've identified 3 types of perfectionism. The first is self-oriented perfectionism. That's what most people think about when they think about perfectionism. So it comes from within, intense drive to be perfect, fused with quite harsh self-criticism. I haven't been perfect. But there was also some social elements of perfectionism that they're observing in their work that also perfectionistic people would report. So this sense that other people expect me to be perfect is quite strong among perfectionistic people. Their sense that the outside world demanded perfection, and people were judging you if you hadn't been perfect. And there was also perfectionism that's turned out onto other people. So that perfectionism I feel in myself, that I need to be perfect at all times, I'm also expecting other people, you, to be perfect at all times. Because if I'm going to rake myself over hot coals, you're going to do it too, because that's only fair. So this other-oriented kind of style of perfection, where we turn that perfection to other people, expecting them to be perfect, is the third element. And those are the 3.
Oh, thank you.
And it's bad.
Yeah, I mean, none of them have good outcomes. I mean, self-oriented has a little bit of evidence that it could produce some performance benefits, but it's really tiny, and you've got to weigh that against what's lost, which is an inability to feel satisfaction in any kind of accomplishment that we make. But socially prescribed and never-oriented, certainly, like those 2, really bad, particularly in the social relationships, but also on mental health.
Well, not to continue on the bad news, but you also note that perfectionism doesn't really improve with age. There is no sort of natural, or there doesn't appear to be in the data, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Thomas, that perfectionism sort of naturally remedies itself as we get older. Is that right?
No, so we don't have, unfortunately, we don't have life course data, but we do know that over a period of time, what we tend to see in perfectionistic people is we haven't followed their perfectionism through, but we've followed sort of allied traits through, and you see that perfectionistic people, unlike other traits like neuroticism, which tends to ameliorate over time slowly, you don't see that with perfectionism. They become a little bit more irritable, a little bit more agitated as they go older. And that's because I think perfectionism creates a bit of a feedback loop. So the higher goals we set for ourselves, the more failure we encounter because those goals are too high. So we set ourselves even higher goals to overcompensate for the feelings of deficiency and anxiety that we feel. We fail again. We start to, again, engage in these kind of self-sabotaging behaviors to try to conceal from the world those failures that are now becoming quite public. And it spirals into a very what we consider to be quite negative thought process and behavioural patterns that unfortunately get worse, if not better, over time. So that's really why it's so important if you kind of relate to these kind of thought patterns and behaviours to seek help. Help seeking is so important to break the cycle. And so, yeah, it's one of those things you have to be aware of from a young age, and if it's coming in, seek help.
You talked in the book about this kind of steep rise in socially prescribed perfectionism starting in 2005. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in 2005 that would all of a sudden make that steep rise occur? Help us understand that.
Well, actually, the date is a little bit later than that, so around about 2007, 2008. And I don't know, did something happen in 2007, 2008? I can't remember now. Was that a significant year? I'm not sure. I think there might have been a few banking issues around that time, but I don't know. I was too young. I was around the bandstand smoking cigarettes.
Good. More on that later.
But no. I think, look, there was a lot of things that started to happen around that time. The credit crunch, obviously, the big one. Social media became ubiquitous. Smartphones come on the scene. The iPhone came on the scene in 2007. So there was a lot of factors that seemed to come around the same time, all of which put more pressure on, particularly young people. The economy slowed right down. Jobs became a lot more difficult. Pace was stagnant. Assets, unfortunately, with the low interest rate environment, started to go up, so it meant young people couldn't get on the housing ladder as easily. And all of these things come at the same time as social media, amplifying perfect lives and lifestyles 24/7, create really, I would say, an echo chamber of limitless perfection, a lot of stress, a lot of high expectations, a lot of need to work excessively hard just to stand still. And all of this thing, I think, comes to a crescendo in the data that we're seeing, where young people are perceiving those pressures as being unrealistic, too lofty, and that's reflected in their skyrocketing levels of socially prescribed perfectionism we're seeing among young people right now.
So these societal problems, I'm contrasting that with this idea that the book is really about hope on some level, right? It's about being hopeful. Help us work through how some of the bad news can lead to a hopeful message.
So here's the thing. One of the things that's really tough, right? Because you hear a lot of hope and very optimistic language in these self-help books, about, and these are very powerful messages, by the way. I'm not being down on the thought, be vulnerable, show yourself, open yourself up to the world, show your authentic self, and all the rest of it. Very helpful messages. But at the root of them is this sense that it's up to you, that you have the power to transform yourself from the inside out. And what I'm saying in my book is actually we have to tackle this problem from the reverse end of the telescope. We have to acknowledge that at some level we can try to change ourselves from the inside out, but we're still going to live inside an economy and a society that is constantly going to prey on those insecurities, that is going to tell us we're not enough because we need to be consuming and working as much as we possibly can. And if at the end of all that self-help, we still can't break that cycle, we go in on ourselves and we blame ourselves for why couldn't we snap out of it? Why isn't this working? Why is it working for other people but it's not working for me? And what I'm saying is the hope here is that we recognize that there is a broader context to these feelings, that they're not just perceptions, that they're not something that's wrong with you, but they are real, logical, and inevitable thoughts that come from living inside a world that is designed to create them. And if we can get our heads around that, what we can do is understand that it's not our fault. That actually there's some power in understanding that this is how the world works, that I'm inside this culture, and that I can take the personal responsibility off my shoulders and know that if I can confront the world as it actually is, not how I'd like it to be, then we can really start to make meaningful steps in the right direction. And what are those steps? Well, we can first of all face the world exactly as it is. We can instantly know that not everything we're going to do is going to have a positive outcome, that we're going to meet setbacks, roadblocks, that there's going to be ups and downs, and that if we can accept that, this is something called radical acceptance. If we can radically accept that sometimes we just can't happen in the world all the time, that the world is going to happen to us, maybe heartbreak, grief, loss, maybe we get made redundant, maybe a global pandemic comes around the corner and screws everything up. Right? These are things that we simply cannot control, even though we're told all the time that we can be the author of our own destiny. And if we can accept sometimes that we can put ourselves on course to get to a place where we would like to be, knowing that it's not going to take it's going to take a long time, maybe even longer than we think it's going to take. Knowing we're going to hit a lot of setbacks, a lot of roadblocks. There's going to be a lot of grief and heartache along the way. But if we can prepare ourselves for that journey and we can meet the world where it is, then I think there's a lot of contentment and a lot of power in that. And so I think it's, for me, the message is about this being not your fault, about there being a bigger context to these feelings, and that if you can live inside that reality, then for me anyway, that was a big rehabilitative moment for me, and I hope for other people too.
Before we got on air, you said that this isn't a self-help book, although what you just said I thought was really great because it does give you some actionable pieces to go on there. But with that, you're not giving up, do X, Y, and Z and you're going to feel better. And
it's a three-step program.
Yeah, a three-step program to get over your perfectionism. But you do, as part of the book, lay out kind of an economic model in the end. It's more of a philosophical component when you're looking at this and the societal components within this. So can you talk a little bit about what that economic model looks like and how that plays into this role? I think you were just talking a little bit about that, but can you expand upon that?
Well, this is why it's two-pronged. Mm-hmm. If we put everything on the individual, then what we do is we kind of absolve any responsibility in the society we live in, creating the shared tension that we live with. We say, well, we can't do anything about that, so we must manage those things ourselves. But if we accept that it is society that's creating the shared tensions in the first place, and that my whole research, the reason I'm writing this book is because I identified aggregate trends. The mean level of perfectionism is changing for everyone. So that doesn't tell us that something's wrong with us. It tells us that something's wrong with the environment in which we live. And so it was really incumbent upon me from that moment onwards to not just speak to people about those realities and try to forge some ways in which we can manage and move past perfectionism and forceful feelings as individuals, but also for us to take responsibility as a society and start to think about how we could create a society that wouldn't need so much perfectionism. Now, this is not a manifesto, and a lot of people it's been out my book's been out in the UK now, and a lot of people are kind of confusing that final chapter as well. Well, this is what Tom would do if he was in charge. What I'm trying to do really with this chapter is as a thought experiment to try to get to people to think about how if we lived inside a society that didn't have growth as its one and only aim, that if it prioritized other aspects of development like human prosperity, human health and well-being, that if it put a floor on the poverty and a ceiling on wealth, if it allowed us to use AI and technologies for the betterment of people to release us from the drudgery of the drudgery aspects of our jobs and use that additional time, not to work more, but to spend more time in our communities and at leisure. The tools are there. We can create and organize a society that prioritizes humans and human health rather than shareholder value. We can do that if we wanted to. It just takes imagination and a sense and a motivation. And so that chapter was really about trying to outline different things that we can maybe think about doing. And if we lived in that society, would we need perfectionism just to get by? And I want readers really to engage in that thought experiment, not as something that's going to actually happen, because I myself am not optimistic that these things will be things that will happen, but nevertheless to think about what would happen if we did live in such a world, to hammer home the point that this isn't an individual issue, or isn't just an individual issue, but is a societal problem that collectively we have to grapple with. So that was really the motivation behind the final chapter.
Yeah. So within there, one of the things that you talked about was universal basic income. If you're a longtime listener of the show, you know that my feelings on this are I'm a big advocate of universal basic income. And from a lot of the things that you were just talking about, this idea of being able to remove, using technology and tools and AI to remove the drudgery, or if I have to work at some, crappy place because I have to be able to pay, as opposed to being able to explore my passions and other pieces along this line. So I'm not going to get into my side on this, but from your perspective, how does that impact perfectionism, and how would it either eliminate some of the kind of elements that drive that? Just help us understand that.
I just think, like, on a level of principle, I think jobs really should be about purpose. And they should be about affording us the discretionary income to thrive, not the survival income to just live and exist, which is essentially what they are now. And I think every person in society deserves that floor, enough money to afford the things they need. And then jobs should be there for us to afford the luxuries and the add-on benefits. And I think but I think there's economic benefits as well that we could go into. That no one in the UBI is dependent on anyone else for their livelihood, right? Like everybody gets the same unconditional payment, right? And then beyond that, it's up to individuals. I think it takes the risk of destitution away, so that we can become more creative, entrepreneurial, so that people are more willing and able to take risks, which clearly has massive impacts on not just productivity, but driving, particularly in modern age where information technologies and creativity and new innovations really drive the motor of the economy. You can see it having that's really, really important benefits. And also in an era of AI, AI is going to increase the productivity of cognitive work. It's going to do that. And if we can use AI to help, for the benefit of everybody, that's to say, we take that productivity gains and we share it, then there's no reason why UBI can't be implemented to as a part of that productivity gain, so that we can, as I said, enjoy more time in our communities with our families and friends and the rest of it. So, I know this is a very utopic argument, but I think a lot of people are coming round to the idea that there could be a place for UBI, and as I say, I think broadly as a society, I think we would be way better off with it. But again, I myself am not overly optimistic that it will happen, but there's some interesting experiments going on, and there's some hope there.
The way that you're getting there, you use the word utopian, maybe, it's dramatic, but the world that you're describing just feels very pre-industrial revolution. Focus on life rather than focus on work to a large degree. That the purpose of getting up in the morning isn't to complete a task at work so much as it is to live your life, which has broader implications. And I think that's really cool. I have a question that is entirely off script because this is a podcast. We can delete it. But what are your thoughts about free will?
I don't know whether I'm very qualified to address this one.
Well, and summarize your answer in 60 seconds.
I mean, it's tough. I think there are questions about that. A lot of the work that I've done in the past is looking at flourishing and how we thrive. And a lot of criticisms of that work has been, well, that's, you assume it's a very conscious process that we have, like we consciously choose to have autonomy in the workplace and find ways to master and feel a sense of competence. I suppose, if we do or don't have free will, if it's the second round effect, right? So it's how we endorse those actions that matter. So do we endorse them as personally meaningful? Do we reflect on them as things that give us a sense of accomplishment and pride, or do we feel like they're things that are done under duress and feel like we're being controlled in some way? So I think my thoughts about free will aren't very complete and they're certainly not coherent, but that would be the answer I could give you.
It's most kind of you to indulge me. Thank you. I wanted to switch over to talk about your very lovely little niglet there about, I spent a lot of time on the bandstand. Okay, so we have to just dive a little bit into Thomas's history here. Are you a musician today? And were you in younger days?
So here's the thing. I'm a terrible singer.
Okay.
I'm a reasonable guitarist, I would say. I used to play around in bands when I was younger with some friends. We were terrible, but it was fun, and that's the main thing. And as I got older, can I tell you a little? This links back to perfectionism. Tell you a little anecdote. As I got older, I started to recoil a little bit from playing because I love playing. I love songwriting. It's helped me through some of the hardest times of my life, but in private, right? Never in public, because I can't sing. And I would always harbor a certain embarrassment about that because, you know, I wasn't perfect at something that I felt like it couldn't, do you know what I mean? Like I couldn't show myself in that way. And it was only when I started to really kind of get out of my comfort zone and start just playing around, singing my songs, even though it was terrible, that I started to feel like I was really doing something with perfectionism, something quite profound. And so giving myself permission, and this is a lesson for everyone, give yourself permission to go out there and do things that bring you joy, right? But don't get consumed by the fear of like looking or sounding terrible, because you may very well do, but that's okay as well. Like, I know I'm terrible when I sing, and writing music has really helped me through, as I said, some of the toughest times of my life, and it is therapeutic. And I'm not going to get up on stage because my talents just aren't ever going to get me there. But being excellent at something, or not being excellent at something, I should say, shouldn't stop you from doing it. And so I would say to everyone, you know, if you do have a passion or a hobby, just because you're not world champion, but just because you're not absolutely exceptional, doesn't mean you shouldn't experience it, doesn't mean you shouldn't enjoy it. So I would consider myself a very bad musician, but a musician that plays and sings and enjoys it all the same.
It reminds me of
podcasters like Tim and me that, you know, are horrible at this, but we still do it. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead, Tim.
When I had been through the conservatory of music and was in madrigal choirs and had to do all this kind of singing, and I never liked my voice. Just never. Always just thought I had a terrible voice. And in my early 30s, decided to take voice lessons. So I found a teacher, and I, in the initial round of interview application, she has me sing, and I'm singing for half an hour without getting any kind of feedback. And finally she stops playing and stops me singing, and she says, "I think I can help you." I'm like, "Great, this is fantastic." She said, "But you have to start by unpuckering your asshole." And that was the key. That was actually the key for me, because I, like you, I was a songwriter. I was playing, I was doing all these things and singing simply because I had to, not because I wanted to, because I didn't enjoy my voice. But okay, but this isn't about me. Thomas, I want.
No, but that is such good advice. I should have put that in the book.
You do have tits over arse, though, or arse over tits, whatever that is.
Arse over tits.
Yeah, A over T. A over T.
A over T. That's
yeah, there you go.
But what? So what kind of music would you take with you if you were on a desert island for a year? What? How about two artists?
Their collection, their catalog. Yeah, not them in person. You don't have to deal with them.
Right. I mean, if I'm marooned on a desert island, that's going to be pretty scary. So I think I'm going to have to take music that meets me where I am. So Joy Division.
Ooh.
Because Curtis' songwriting is incredible. Voice is haunting.
Yes.
And talks a lot about loneliness and alienation. And I think that would definitely meet me where I am on the desert island.
Oh my God. It would depress the shit out of me.
But you look at him and again, I mean... Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
But then you got to go. Then you got to go the opposite, haven't you? You got to give yourself a lift. And I would probably say for that side of things, I would probably have. Let me think. What do I normally listen to put me in a good mood? Bruno Mars.
Oh, that's
I like that.
Yeah, I'm a fan, and I think there's a lot. The music is very upbeat. Very positive, so I'd probably kind of counterbalance Curtis with Mars, and I think that would make a good mix.
That would be good because Curtis's demise was not a good one. So
no,
it's
sadly not. Yeah.
So you don't want to listen to too much because that might just push you over the edge. You bring that with Bruno, and I love that. I love those combination there. So.
Exactly. When the sun is shining and everything's happy, a bit of Mars, and then when it's not, when you're having a bit of a low point, and it works.
Well, and as I always, Tim knows this. I've talked about like, why do I listen to some really angry or depressing music, and part of me is going, well, I might be pissed off at the world, but I'm not that pissed off, right? It's like, I'm not anywhere near that level of depression. So, all right, I'm okay. This is good. There you go. So
I think also like it's about matching. I think music for me is like really about meeting myself where I am in that moment. And sometimes like when I'm at a low point, it's quite cathartic to listen to music that meets you where you are in that moment. And when you're on a high, stick on for a day dancing or whatever. Just get it on loud. It's really about. I think music is a, for me anyway. It's a soundtrack to life.
Yeah. Well, and I've heard this about music and poetry and different pieces is that, part of the benefit that we get from it is that, as you said, it meets you where you are, but it also shows you're not alone, that there are others out there that are experiencing these same emotions, these same feelings that we have. And as you said, it's a soundtrack for life, but it's a shared life as opposed to a solitary, I'm the only one going through this. And there's something cathartic about that.
Hugely. And writing music as well. Oh my God, that has helped me through some of the toughest times in my life, just sitting with my guitar and writing. And, and a lot of those songs, those songs I think probably most of them I haven't sung to anyone. But in those private moments, it's been so useful. It's been so helpful. So I'm loving this podcast because I think psychology and music is where it's at.
I just want to say amen to that. I'm just going to say amen to that, Thomas. And however, all good things must come to an end. And we are so happy to have had the time with you. Thank you for being a guest on Behavioral Grooves today.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Thomas, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our perfect brains.
Perfect. Wow. You
asked me, if I was paralyzed by perfection, and I paralyzed up front. And so
you did.
Obviously, I must have a perfect brain. Is that not how that works?
I think that's what they call pretzel logic.
I could be a pretzel. I know that. No. So it's interesting though, right? This idea of perfectionism. I mean, we've had a couple guests on the show talking about perfectionism, and you and I know that we are both very far from perfectionism. Anybody who listens to this podcast can know that we are very far from.
But it took me a while to get here. Right. And were you? I mean, the fact that you got through a PhD program kind of says that you had to have some striving for some ideal.
I don't know if it was perfectionism. I think it was just I might have high goals, but perfectionism isn't part of those goals. It's interesting, right? Because I can see this and I can see it in others. And there's a part of me that just wants to go and shake them and say, stop. You don't have to get that last 2% improvement. You're going to spend hours and hours and hours. And the likelihood of anybody making a big difference anywhere is probably not that big. And then, those people can come back and say, but you don't understand that 2% is really important. And so I see it. It's a conundrum that we are in.
It really is. I think you had even pointed out in an earlier conversation, Kurt, about how this idea of perfectionism has been a part of our culture, at least in the United States. And I think this is definitely true in some cultures. Certainly I see it in Asian cultures like in China and Japan. But there's this sense that gets summed up by Vince Lombardi's comment that perfection is not attainable, but if we chase perfection, we can catch excellence. So there's this underlying message of, oh, it's okay, perfectionism really isn't attainable, but, oh, by the way, you should still go for it.
Well, and as Thomas said, it's the socially acceptable flaw. Right. This is the flaw that everybody like goes, oh yeah, you shouldn't be. But man, we hold those perfectionists up on pedestals, and it's okay if you are stating, I'm just trying to be perfect. And that's a good thing. And as we said, who was the guest that we had that was talking about, just working all of those hours and trying to be just so perfect in the job and all of the work that she did. And in the end, it was just, it didn't give her the happiness, which is what I think Thomas is really pointing out here, the happiness or satisfaction that she thought it would. And I think that's the big crux of all of this, is that it's not about being perfect for perfect's sake. It's that the perfectionism is trying to fill some hole, as you mentioned in the intro. It's to take some aspect of our lives that is missing or not quite up to snuff, and we think we can solve it if we're only perfect.
Yeah, I think you're actually referring to Jennifer Moss from episode 301. She did a really great job of sort of teeing this up about being really smart and really driven, but being driven wasn't enough. There was a sense of perfectionism, which led to burnout.
Yeah.
So we know that there's at least that consequence of it. I'm wondering why there isn't more emphasis in our world that is just so ridiculously demanding on satisficing. Herb Simon's concept of satisficing. God, that was the 1950s. He came up with that.
Yeah, the maximizer versus the satisficer. And in his work, if I am not misquoting it here, is that the idea that satisficers just live typically a happier, more well-rounded life. This idea that there's a certain standard, and then after that standard, it's like, take whatever you can because that's good enough. And going on, it's like you picking me as your co-host, right? It was like, hey, Kurt, you're good enough, right?
Yeah. And I feel like we haven't drawn into that really great behavioral science observation. And for those gurus who aren't familiar with the term satisficing, it's really about being acceptable and satisfactory, and in a really good way, in a really healthy way, not just like, giving in. It's like saying, hey, this is good enough. And it always gets back for me to Dick Thaler when he said, it's not that we're dumb, it's that life is hard. So there could be more satisficing. I think that there'd be more happiness.
So how does this fit into finding your groove? How does this play in from the fact that we need to satisfy more? Is there an element? Because there's a element of finding your groove that is about being good and maybe like you and your music. You said the perfectionism helped you, become a better musician. But in the end, did it really help me understand? How does that fit into finding your groove?
Yeah, and it didn't make me happier. I don't think that I was more in the groove, in my musical groove, when I was striving for perfection. I was absolutely not in my groove. I got in my groove musically after I started to give up on the perfection story.
Oh,
yeah. I certainly enjoy playing at a high level, but that was sort of just a side benefit, I suppose, if you would. I could have enjoyed playing at a lower degree of proficiency, I think, pretty adequately. But it really perfectionism got in the way of me finding my groove.
Well, I think it gets in the way, too, of many people from a social perspective, particularly, and I think Thomas talks about this in his book a bit about, the different types of perfectionism there are. And there's that perfection for yourself, but then you can also have a perfectionism that is about what you require from others. And in those situations, it's like really difficult to have really positive, good relationships, which we know is a big piece of our well-being and happiness and all of those factors. And it's part of finding your groove is like, when are you good enough with yourself? That's part of finding your groove and being okay with some less than perfect kind of elements and saying, that's okay. I'm okay with not being, the best podcaster in the entire world. I'm good enough. Or at least in my brain, I'm good enough. I don't know if our listeners think of that. They're going, God, Tim, get rid of Curran. You'd be so much better. But
I get that note all the time. Yeah, I just don't tell you about it.
Well, thank you for that. But there's an aspect of that. I think in everybody's lives, there are certain things that you do want to make sure you're good at and proficient to a certain level. And that level doesn't have to be just good enough. It can be good to great to some other aspect, but there's a trade-off. And so where do we make that trade-off, and how does that fit into our lives and making it overall better?
Yeah, that striving, I think about athletes, that if you're really good as a child and then you get into, say, some special leagues, just above and beyond your school stuff in grade school, and then in high school, you're playing at a very high level, and your team goes to state, and then you're expected, well, I'm going to play whatever sport I'm in college. Yeah. And that's going to be, and then what's after that? Professional sports. It's like, well, wait a minute. The numbers draw down significantly between college players, the number of college players and the number of professional players.
Number of high school players to college players. Again, huge drop-offs, right?
Huge drop-off. Yeah. So I think striving for perfection can kind of get in the way of just enjoying the sport. It's not a bad thing to work hard, have high goals. You talked about a PhD, having high goals, great. But the striving for perfection I think it's an inhibitor, actually.
Yeah, it can definitely create a angst within oneself, because as even Vince Lombardi said, perfection is not attainable.
There
right?
It is. There it
so
is.
I think that's really important. Anything else you want to just chat on about our company? We talked about UBI, 4-day work week is kind of a utopian world. Come on. Anything. They were all interesting. And
it was all
me, I love UBI. So there you go.
So this might be kind of silly, but what about we've been talking about artists, and we talked about music and musicians being perfectionists. What about musicians who are perfectionists? What about Keith Richards is known as being this incredible perfectionist in the Rolling Stones?
Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses. I know that, again, you hear these stories, right? And so is this part of that societal aspect? We put these people well, if they're perfectionists, that's why they got to be so big. Ludacris, right? He calls himself a perfectionist. Tom Petty, wasn't he? He was always 57 takes on this one little riff, and 5 different guitars to get the absolutely right sound. And
or Sheryl Crow. I mean, we've talked about the story of Sheryl Crow. After Hugh Padgham, who was a great producer, actually produced Elton John and Sting. After he had done that, he produced Sheryl Crow, and Sheryl Crow didn't like the record, so she trashed it and went off and cut her contract with the label, had to pay the label for the cost of the record, and then went and recorded it all over again on her own.
Yeah.
If that isn't just an incredible, that's not just high goals. That feels like that's perfectionism.
Well, to a certain degree. I mean, it's crazy. So, which is, again, we're building into the societal acceptance. We're saying, well, in these cases, look at what it did. You have this fantastic piece of art, this fantastic piece of music, because they were perfectionists. But you kind of have to wonder, all right, maybe you could have had, I can't get no satisfaction without, however many takes that Keith Richards made him do, or the specifics, that it could have been.
You wonder.
Good enough. I don't know. All right. Well, now we've just twisted everybody's brains around all this, and so we could definitely spend a ton of more time talking about Thomas's great research and the book, The Perfection Trap. But I think we should just end it there. I think we've covered all. I think we ought to suffice and just say we've covered all of the key points.
I think that's good. I think that we did cover the key points. And I would just reiterate to groovers that if they enjoyed this conversation with Thomas, if they enjoyed our grooving session at all, share it. Share it in some way. Share it with a friend. Yeah. Share it with someone that they care about. Maybe there's someone who's just being a little too striving for perfection and might need to hear this story. So we encourage you to share that with them. And hopefully you can take this as a listener and use it this week to help you go out and find your groove.